Okay, so I know that some people are in a different time zone, so they won't be able to attend even though they've registered. So I'm just going to assume that we're all here. So welcome to this webinar on painful periods and what you can do about them. So it's presented by me, Marie Glaeser, and I'm a nutritional therapist with a background in psychology. I worked for 4 years as a psychological wellbeing practitioner in the NHS in the UK before retraining as a nutritional therapist because I wanted to be able to address difficulties that my clients were having in a more holistic way. So now I work from Copenhagen and I'm specialized in digestive health, mental well-being, and autoimmunity. And each of these three areas relates to painful periods in some way. So we'll touch on that a bit today. But we'll just focus on specific areas for today's webinar so we don't overwhelm you with information. I also just recently published my first book, 7 Days of Being Kinder to Yourself. So that's a book using cognitive behavioral therapy and nutrition just to address difficulties like depression and burnout and stress. So you can have a look at that on my website if you're interested. Before we get started, I just have to give a quick disclaimer. None of the information provided here today is intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any medical conditions, and you should always consult your medical professional before making any changes to your diet or lifestyle. The material provided is also on an as-is basis. The science in nutrition changes very, very quickly, so I can't always be sure that everything I'm saying or that I've released is up to date. So this presentation was made very recently, and right now everything is up to date, but if you watch this on a recording later on, there might be some things that have changed. Everything is referenced and you can see those references at the end of the presentation, so you can check on that as well. What we're going to cover today, we're going to start by just defining painful periods because we might all have different understanding of what that means. And I'll give you a brief overview of the causes at the beginning. Then we'll take a little deep dive into your hormones and menstrual cycle, which might seem tedious, but I think it's really important because the changes I recommend at the end of the webinar are based on these things, your hormones and your menstrual cycle. And if you don't understand the links, it's harder to be motivated to make those changes. So bear with me on the sciencey parts. Then we'll take a closer look at what causes painful periods. And then we'll get into those nutritional and lifestyle strategies that you can use to address the causes. At the end, we'll also look at nutritional and lifestyle support during a painful period. So some emergency tips and tricks in case you ever need them. There'll be some time for questions at the end, but what I'd love for you to do is just to put those questions into the chat. The chat comes through to me privately, so only I can see your questions. And then I'll answer those questions at the end. So before we talk about what painful periods are, I'd just like us to take a moment to recognize that our periods are actually kind of an amazing process. So the endometrial lining of the uterus, so that's the lining that's shed every month, is the only adult tissue in the body that routinely regenerates itself. So it's a whole body tissue that's just remaking itself, which is magic. And I think because of the kind of traditional stigma that there has been around periods and also around this idea that periods are painful, it's a woman's curse, all of that kind of has obliterated this knowledge of how magical periods actually are. And what I'm hoping is that this webinar will give you a chance to, first of all, recognize how cool they can be, and then once your periods stop hurting you once a month, also be able to appreciate that every month. So what's a painful period? 90% of women will report menstrual cramps. So that means almost all of us do feel something when we get our periods each month, which makes sense because there is a tissue in our bodies that's detaching itself and shedding. But only 55% of us need pain medication to manage that pain. And only 32% of us have to miss work or school or other obligations because of those painful periods. So you can see that's a bit of a funnel shape. It's really normal to have some menstrual cramping, but then less people require pain medication and even less are then impaired in their functioning because of those painful periods. So why do those cramps happen? Well, they happen because, like I said, the uterus lining has to contract to try and get rid of that tissue that's being shed. And that will normally happen 1 to 2 days before your period. So normally we have some indication that we're about to get a period, and then on days 1 and 2 of the period itself. More severe pain is called dysmenorrhea, and that's what's not normal. So if you're needing regular pain medication, a lot of pain medication, or you have to stop doing what you normally do because of your pain, then that's an indication that something's not working as it should. And there are 2 types of dysmenorrhea. So it might be primary, which will normally start as soon as you get your period. So those are the women who quite early on maybe had an irregular cycle, or there was something going on. Perhaps your doctor prescribed birth control medication early on, and you've just always noticed that, periods are quite painful for you and quite difficult for you. Secondary dysmenorrhea normally starts a bit later, so usually after the age of 20, and is normally caused by something underlying. So there might be an underlying health condition that's causing those symptoms. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute when we look into the causes. You'll notice, or you'll know, that when you have a painful period, you have other symptoms as well. So it's not just abdominal cramping, and it's not just kind of in the uterus area. So you'll notice the pain will go into your back. It can radiate up and down from there. You'll notice pain in your thighs. And you'll also notice other symptoms which seem somehow unrelated but are related. So tiredness, low mood, difficulty concentrating, dizziness, diarrhea, nausea, or in very severe cases, vomiting as well. So I'm guessing most of you, if you're here, recognize some of these symptoms. Now, like I said before, painful periods are often normalized. So often symptoms are underreported. And I believe, and I think a lot of researchers also believe, that many more women have these more severe symptoms. And it's a shame because they don't need to be there. So what causes those painful periods? Before I talk about the causes that I'm interested in this webinar, I just want to kind of highlight to you that if you have some of these more severe symptoms, so pain that limits mobility, or that lasts for more than 1 or 2 days, or that's not manageable by over-the-counter medication, or that means you're taking medication for a period of a week or more, very heavy, very irregular, or missing periods, all of that can be a sign that there's an underlying health condition. So that's secondary dysmenorrhea. So possible causes can be things like fibroids. If you're just getting it once, kind of normally your period is fine, and then all of a sudden you have a very heavy or painful period, that can be a sign of a cyst. It can be endometriosis, polycystic ovaries, pelvic inflammation, a small cervix, thyroid conditions. So there's all these other conditions that can be causing these more severe symptoms. So if you do have some of these, I would recommend speaking to your medical health care practitioner and just asking them to rule out those other causes. If the other causes have been ruled out, then that's more what I'm talking about in today's webinar. So the things that could cause primary dysmenorrhea are things like hormonal imbalances, prostaglandin imbalances, blood sugar imbalances, inflammation, and nutrient deficiencies. And I'll go into each of those in a bit more detail as we go through the webinar. Before that, a little bit of science and biology. So I'm just going to get my pointer out so I can show you what I'm talking about. So where do I start? So just so we all know which terms I'm using, make sure we're all on the same page. So over here, you can see on my pointer, that's the uterus when I mentioned that. Then below that, you have your vagina. And then here on the sides, those are your ovaries and the fallopian tubes, which lead into the uterus. The uterus is lined by something called the endometrium. So you can see that kind of red tissue here. And as you can see in this image, the endometrium, like I said earlier, actually decreases and increases in size throughout your menstrual cycle. So during your period, it will shed and it will come to its thinnest point at the end of your period. And then from then on, it kind of starts to build up again until it's nice and thick just before your next period starts. In your ovaries, you have what we call follicles. And actually, every woman has millions of follicles. And each month, one follicle becomes the chosen one and begins to grow until eventually it's released into the fallopian tube during ovulation, where it can then be fertilized if there's sperm. And then you have what's left over, the corpus luteum. And that's important in terms of your hormones, and I'll get into that in a second. But just to say about these follicles, so don't worry, you don't have millions of periods throughout your life. Actually, only about 400 of the follicles will mature in a woman's lifetime and be released. So that's like 0.2% of the number of follicles that you have will actually be released as an egg during ovulation. A bit of a closer look at the hormones as well. So first of all, just to show where your cycle starts. So your cycle starts on the first day of your period, and it has two phases. So the first phase is the follicular phase, which is from here, from your first day of your period until the day that you ovulate. Now, traditionally, it was thought that was always on day 14, but now we know that actually a 28-day cycle is quite rare. So most women are something between 21 days and 32 days. If you're significantly shorter or longer than that, again, that might be an indication to speak to your healthcare provider just to see what could be going on there. After ovulation, the second phase of your period starts, and that's the luteal phase, and that goes until the last day before your next period. So just to show you a bit about the hormones, these are the four main hormones that regulate the female menstrual cycle. So you have FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, and this is the hormone that's used to choose a follicle every month. So if there's something wrong with this hormone, you don't choose a follicle to mature, which means that you won't get any matured follicle to ovulate. So if this hormone is off, you won't be ovulating in a typical month. What can also happen, and this often happens with polycystic ovary syndrome, is that this hormone triggers many follicles to mature at the same time, but they don't fully mature. So that's when you get what's called a string of pearls on your ultrasound. So there'll be lots of half-matured follicles stuck in your ovaries, and none of them have been ovulated. And that can cause pain when one of them eventually tries to be ovulated. So that's the first hormone. The second hormone is over here, this red line, and that's your luteinizing hormone. And this hormone is important because it's what triggers ovulation. So this spike over here is necessary for this wonderful picture for your egg to be released into the fallopian tube. So again, if this hormone is off, you won't be ovulating regularly. In order for this hormone to spike, your estrogen levels need to spike. So this spike of estrogen is what triggers this spike of LH. And your estrogen levels rise here because your follicle is developing. So if no follicle is maturing, then your estrogen levels won't spike. The last hormone is progesterone, which is down here. And you can see during the first part of your cycle, it's low, and then it goes up and comes down again. Now it goes up here because of the corpus luteum. So that's that empty follicle after ovulation. It releases progesterone because progesterone's job is to keep the endometrial lining nice and thick so that an egg can implant for pregnancy. That's why also progesterone levels are higher during pregnancy. So it's important that your progesterone levels stay high because otherwise the endometrial lining will shed, and that's when you're at risk of miscarriages. Couple of fun facts about these hormones. So you'll notice that at the beginning of your cycle, when your estrogen and progesterone levels are low, your skin will be a lot drier because these two hormones are necessary for collagen production. So over here, for example, when your estrogen is peaking, and here again, you'll notice your skin is much fuller, much more likely to be glowing. But when your progesterone levels are too high, that can cause acne. So you'll notice maybe more spots on your skin. You'll also notice that if your progesterone levels drop off very quickly at the end of the month, that you're more likely to have mood swings and PMS symptoms before your period. So just to summarize that then, we have follicle stimulating hormone, which is responsible for maturing a follicle into an egg that's ovulated, that's produced in your brain. LH is what's responsible for ovulation. It's again produced in your brain, but triggered by estrogen. So because both of these hormones are produced in your brain, what that means is that if you're very stressed, if something is going on emotionally, these two hormones can become dysregulated. And that's why we sometimes notice that during stressful periods, your period becomes more painful. Then you have the progesterone, which keeps the endometrial lining thick, and that's produced by your mature follicle or an implanted egg during pregnancy, and the same with estrogen. Now, just to show how these hormones are linked and how an imbalance in one can trigger imbalances in others. If we start with your follicle stimulating hormone, that's necessary to cause your estrogen levels to rise. If your estrogen levels don't rise, then your luteinizing hormone won't spike either. And if your luteinizing hormone doesn't spike, you don't ovulate, so your progesterone levels don't rise. So if at any point in this cycle, one of these hormones becomes off, it affects the other hormones as well. So we very quickly get this vicious cycle of imbalanced hormones. And stress can play a really big role in that because stress will dysregulate things like FSH and LH, and then we've got the whole cycle off. So I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with all of that information, but I think it's good to know. So how does a hormone imbalance cause a painful period? One way can be through estrogen dominance. Estrogen dominance doesn't necessarily mean that you have very high levels of estrogen. It might just mean that you have more estrogen relative to your other hormones. And you'll notice if that's the case for you because you'll have this very specific symptom pattern. So you won't have all of these symptoms, but you'll have some. So, for example, you'll notice that your breasts are very tender and swollen, particularly coming up to ovulation or coming up to your period. You might be more likely to have lumps. Your libido might be lower. You might have more mood swings. And water retention is a really big sign, actually. So if you notice that your body's very swollen and firmly swollen, so firm to touch, that's a sign of water retention. Unwanted weight gain, trouble sleeping, things like that. So if you're noticing this kind of pattern, it could be that this excess level of estrogen is what's contributing to your painful periods. Another thing that might happen from hormone imbalances is not ovulating during a cycle, which is called anovulation. And this is actually quite common. So signs are that your period is a lot later than usual, or you're spotting in the middle of your cycle. And again, it comes from these dysregulated hormones that can be caused by severe changes to your diet or exercise, stress, a disrupted routine, medical conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, menopause, or hormonal birth control. So this is actually why hormonal birth control works in terms of regulating painful periods, because the hormonal birth control means you never ovulate. So you never get your normal period. You don't get those ups and downs of those hormones. And if your painful period is caused by that, then you'll notice that that doesn't happen so much. You'll get less pain. This polycystic ovary syndrome, so that's that development of a string of pearls, so many follicles partly developing in your ovaries and then having trouble ovulating them. So these are some of the hormone causes. And I'm going to give you a little bit more science and then I'll stop, I promise. So I just want to show you how some lifestyle factors can trigger these hormone imbalances or exacerbate them. So to understand that, we need to understand where hormones come from. So if you look at my pointer, top left-hand corner of the page, you have cholesterol. Cholesterol has a bad name, but it's actually necessary for the production of all of your hormones. So it's a really important nutrient. Now you can see that cholesterol produces progesterone, it produces your stress hormone cortisol, it produces testosterone, which we women also have, and it produces our estrogens. So there's 3 different types: estrone, estradiol, and estriol. And estradiol is the most potent one over here. So what can happen if we have an excess production of one of these hormones is that all the cholesterol gets diverted and then there's not enough for the others. So very common is something called a pregnenolone steal, which is where the cortisol goes down here and all gets turned into cortisol during a stressful period. And then you have downregulated other sex hormones. So that can have this knock-on impact and trigger painful periods. Other things that can cause imbalances are things like inflammation, dysregulated blood sugar, and weight gain or obesity, and also other things like toxins, so alcohol, coffee, things like that. So what you can see there is, for example, over here, when you look at the progesterone, a form of progesterone, which is called 5-alpha reductase, is produced more when we have high insulin levels, so poor blood sugar regulation, and obesity. And that hormone causes this development of string of pearls. So when we're not ovulating, when we're having all these imbalanced hormones, and other symptoms. So for example, thinning hair, acne, facial hair growth. So if you're noticing a lot of kind of male pattern hair growth, that could be a sign that you're producing too much of this 5-alpha reductase. And I spoke about estrogen dominance before. So that's when we have too much of what's called estradiol. And that, again, over here you can see is upregulated by inflammation, high insulin, adipose tissue, so fat tissue, and again here inflammation. So if we have high levels of inflammation, it's all coming into this very, very strong estrogen, which can cause all of those symptoms like water retention, painful breasts, stuff like that. And normally what should happen is this should be converted down to here and then peed out. So if this pathway here is not working, then that can cause an buildup of estrogen, which again can cause a lot of those symptoms. And you can see down here, magnesium is needed for that conversion. And that again is depleted by things like coffee, alcohol, stress. So I hope I've kind of made that clear and haven't overwhelmed you. Before we go on, I just wanted to talk about prostaglandins as well. So that's the other cause that I mentioned for painful periods. Prostaglandins are hormone-like substances, and what they do is they make your muscles relax and contract, and they cause uterus contraction during your period. So that contraction is necessary to shed the tissue, otherwise it would just be stuck there. But if your prostaglandins are imbalanced, that can cause painful period cramps. So the imbalance might be that there's too many prostaglandins which cause contraction, or it might be that you have a normal amount of them, but they're binding too much to your uterus tissue. Or it might be that they're dysregulated. So there's the ones that cause relaxation and contraction, and it might be that those two are signaling at the same time. So your muscle tissue is trying to relax and contract at the same time. And again, that will cause pain. Fun fact, NSAIDs, so painkillers like ibuprofen, actually work by inhibiting prostaglandins. So if you find that painkillers are very effective for you in reducing your period pains, that could be a sign that for you, the pain is caused by the prostaglandins. If painkillers don't work for you very well, that might be a sign that it's something to do with nutrient deficiencies or hormone imbalances for you instead. A bit more about those prostaglandins. So the pro-inflammatory prostaglandins, or the ones that cause contraction, their building block is omega-6 fatty acids in part. So omega-6 fatty acids we get in our diets a lot. So they come from conventionally raised animal products. So if you just get normal chicken or meat or eggs or milk instead of organic and free range. It comes from vegetable oils like rapeseed, sunflower oil. It comes from processed foods, margarine, all of those sort of things. Nuts, seeds. So there's lots of sources of omega-6. So it's quite likely that we have high amounts of these contracting prostaglandins nowadays. And then you have the anti-inflammatory prostaglandins, or the ones that cause relaxation. And they come from your omega-3 fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory. And those you find in oily fish, seafood, walnuts, chia seeds, linseeds, anything like that. So if you notice that maybe your diet is quite high in omega-6 and low in omega-3, and painkillers help you, this could be a path for you to go down to try and address your period pains. And research actually shows that women with dysmenorrhea, so painful periods, have higher levels of those pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. So there does seem to be a real link there. Just to summarize that then. So the things that can cause prostaglandin imbalances are inflammation, high levels of omega-6, hormone imbalances. So if you have dysregulated progesterone levels, then the prostaglandins bind differently and are produced differently. So if you're not ovulating, or if your progesterone stays too high throughout your cycle, then that can cause these pains. And stress as well. So stress, first of all, will dysregulate your progesterone levels. So you've already got those hormone imbalances, but actually high cortisol and high adrenaline levels also change the way that your prostaglandins bind to your tissues. So again, can cause more of that contraction. Okay, so just to show how that links up with the research. So we've got here that hormone imbalances cause pain, prostaglandins cause pain, and the factors that cause those imbalances are things like inflammation, stress, inflammation and stress and diet. And so the lifestyle factors that are linked with period pain are actually a lack of physical activity, low or high BMI, diet, poor stress management, and high exposure to toxins, all of which can contribute to those factors that we've spoken about. So what do you do about it? Now, I'm going to give you quite a few tips to change, but what I want you to hold in mind is that actually every change you make has a knock-on effect. So you don't need to change everything at the same time, because each thing you do is kind of like building a house with a bunch of bricks. So every change you make is laying another brick onto that foundation of that house. So the more you do, yes, the further you get, but everything is already a step of the way. So the first thing to do is to manage stress, and we'll talk about how to do that. Then we'll talk about balancing blood sugar, because like we saw on those pathways, high insulin levels can really contribute to hormone imbalances, but also high insulin and high blood sugar levels increase inflammation, so that can then cause your prostaglandins to be more inflammatory and painful. Then we'll talk about reducing inflammation, and finally we'll talk about supporting detoxification. And these are the things we'll talk about in each. And like I said, I want you to remember that everything you do is building on the next thing, and everything you do is already having a beneficial effect for the next step. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. Managing stress. So the first tip that I would give for managing stress would be to start doing regular breathing exercises throughout your day, deep breathing exercises, because research shows that both objectively and subjectively, that leads to reduced stress levels. And it's a really easy thing to do. So I'm just going to give you some examples, concrete examples of what you can do. For example, you can do something called 4-1-5 breathing, which we'll just do together now. If you're all, get you all to kind of refocus in case you're multitasking. So if you all just sit up straight in your chair or wherever you're sitting, and just place your hands on your belly, and then breathe in with me for a count of 4 and feel your belly expanding. Then you hold for a count of 1, and then breathe out for a count of 5. Okay, again, breathe in. Hold for a count of 1, and breathe out for a count of 5. Another breathing exercise you can do is something called lateral breathing. So move your hands up so that they're now resting on your rib cage with your fingers meeting in the middle just above your diaphragm. Then, as you breathe in, feel how your rib cage expands and how your fingers are moved apart by that expansion. So breathe in. And then breathe out and feel how your fingers are moved back together as your rib cage contracts again. Breathe in again. And breathe out again. If you're anything like me, just those 4 deep breaths will already make quite a big difference in how you're feeling. But what I would recommend is to try and make this part of your daily practice. So either do this before your meals or before you get out of bed at night, or in the morning, get out of bed in the morning, or before you go to sleep at night. And that actually brings me to my next point, which is sleep hygiene. So stress management is really linked up with your sleep. Good sleep is essential, and there's some really simple things you can do to improve your sleep. So some examples are making sure your bedroom is completely dark at night, and then making sure that you're exposed to daylight first thing in the morning. So that might be just opening the blinds, being by the window, getting outside if you can. Other things you can do is limit your screen time at night or install something on your laptop or phone to block the blue light. And the other thing I would recommend is starting to dim the lights after dinner so your body kind of gets into that relaxed mode, ready for bed. These two link up, so we've got time outdoors and movement. Again, so much research shows that both of these things are really beneficial for stress levels, and not just how people feel, but actually also the stress hormones in their body and inflammatory markers. So time outdoors, if you haven't got a lot of time, research shows that even just looking out of a window at nature has an effect. But if you can incorporate something like having lunch outside, going for a walk, walking part of the way to work, all of those kinds of things are really beneficial already. And again, with movement, just like with breathing, it doesn't have to be something big. So you don't have to sit and meditate for an hour. You don't have to go to the gym for an hour. You can do 1 minute of breathing in the morning and 5 minutes of stretching in the evening. And that's already a really big difference. Even on those days where you're feeling really sluggish and in pain, try and keep up with these really manageable behaviors. Magnesium soaking. So this is one of my favorites. Magnesium is a nutrient that's essential in our bodies for managing inflammation, blood sugar regulation, and stress. And actually, when we're stressed, we lose much more magnesium. It's also important for your hormone balance, as you saw in that very complicated diagram I showed you. So what you can do is just 2 to 3 times a week, have a magnesium bath or foot bath if you haven't got a bathtub. Just get some magnesium salts or Epsom salts, put a cup of those in your water, and sit and soak for 20 minutes. The last one is massages. So massages have been shown to release a substance called oxytocin, which is a hormone that helps us to feel content, connected, and also helps us to manage pain. So it really raises our pain threshold. Now, not all of us can afford massages, not all of us have someone to massage us, but actually self-massage increases oxytocin levels just as much as being massaged by someone else. So after you've had your foot bath or your bath, just take some time to massage some cream into your hands, into your feet, things like that. Now, all of the things that I've just mentioned actually will help you balance your blood sugar. So if you just do the managing stress stuff, you're already helping your body balance blood sugar better. If you want to do more, I would recommend eating it according to my golden rule. So what that means is that every snack, meal, drink should include some source of complex carbohydrates, so that's something with fiber, a healthy protein, and a healthy fat. Now, this is a whole topic of its own, and I have written about that on my blog. But if this is something that you'd like to do, I recommend working with someone so that they can help you find the right foods for you. Fiber, so increasing fiber research shows that people who eat more fiber, first of all, have better blood sugar regulation, they have lower levels of inflammation, and women who eat more fiber have less painful periods. So you'll find fiber in things like whole fruits and vegetables with their peel, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and beans and legumes. So just making sure that every day you're having a few of those foods. This unfortunately doesn't mean drink caffeine and alcohol, it means reduce caffeine and alcohol. Both of these can cause blood sugar spikes and stress hormone spikes. So you don't want either of those things when you're trying to reduce the pain of your periods. So try and cut down to, 1 cup of coffee a day or caffeinated drink, which includes Coke, energy drinks, black tea, to some degree green tea, but less. And alcohol, just, a glass of wine once or twice a week. And finally, replace sugar. So, I'm not saying you can never eat anything sweet, but I would say try and avoid using refined sugar in your cooking and baking and drinks. So things you can have instead are things like applesauce with walnuts, you can have dates, you can have raw honey, you can have bananas. I will send you a handout after this webinar, so you'll get some recipes and some ideas. But just try and think about where can you find a source of sweet food that also contains that all-important fiber. Next, we'll talk about inflammation. So again, just like with blood sugar, the things you're doing to manage your blood sugar and to manage your stress will already be reducing inflammation levels in your body. As an extra step, you can increase your omega-3 intake. So you can find that from oily fish, seafood, chia seeds, walnuts, linseeds. So, have some smoked salmon pate or put some linseeds or chia seeds into your morning porridge, put some walnuts on your salads. Find easy ways to incorporate a bit more of that in your diet. Or you can consider an algae supplement. But with supplements, I always recommend working with a practitioner just so that they can make sure that what you're taking is effective and safe for you. Then finally, support detoxification. Again, just like before, everything you'll be doing will already be helping your body detoxify better. For some extra steps, you can increase your intake of cruciferous vegetables. So that's things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, and your intake of leafy greens. So again, spinach, kale, chard, watercress, rocket, all those kinds of things. Easy ways to increase these foods is just have some bags of frozen leafy greens or frozen kale or frozen broccoli in your freezer. And whenever you're making a meal, just throw in a bunch of that. So if you're making a stew, throw in some frozen spinach. If you're making soup, throw in some frozen kale. If you're making a stir fry, add some broccoli. So, make it easy for yourself to just throw in rather than having an overwhelming shopping list and to-do list in the kitchen. I'll also be sending you some smoothie recipes where you can also have some, ideas of where to incorporate these a bit more easily. And finally, reduce your exposure to toxins. So that's things like alcohol, coffee, and plastics. And then things that so plastic food containers and plastic water bottles in particular. And then things that you find in kind of conventional shampoos, body creams, face creams, things like that. All of those can impact your hormone levels and can contribute to inflammation levels. So by reducing that, you're just making it a bit easier for your body to find balance within itself, that it doesn't have to also cope with all of these things that are coming from the outside, making a mess of the hormones. Putting that all together then, we've got these 4 groups of changes to make, and altogether, they will lead to a reduced likelihood of period pain. But like with anything in nutrition, none of these is an answer to everything. So, one of these changes won't change everything for you, although it might change quite a bit of stuff. It's more the way these things work together and over time will help your body find balance and help your body reduce the pain in your periods. And research shows that it takes about 3 months. So what you'll find is that you start to make some of these changes and maybe you'll notice some immediate differences, but you'll only see a real difference after 3 months. So don't be demotivated by a painful period, just keep going, give it time, let your body settle in, and then reap the benefits at the end of a really consistent period of putting these things into practice. So, acute pain management. Unfortunately, change is not really linear. So you might see improvements 1 month and then the next month you might notice pain again. Or you might have been fine for 6 months and suddenly you have a really painful period. That's quite normal. So if it happens, don't panic. And a lot of us will panic or feel like we've done something wrong or we're not doing the right things or we're missing something. But actually, that might not be the case. You might be doing everything right. It might just be that your body needs a little bit more time. Knowing that can help you to kind of manage if it does happen. And so it's good to have some emergency strategies for when you are in a lot of pain. So some things that I would recommend are kind of applying gentle heat to the area of pain. Research shows that that really helps with reducing the pain. And gentle stretching. So if we're in a lot of pain, it's really tempting to curl up in a fetal position and not move anymore. But actually that can contribute to the tension and stress, which can then increase the pain. So there's lots of really good YouTube videos. And again, I'll be sending some links in the pack after the webinar for just, 2-minute, 5-minute stretches, just to help your body relax a little bit, reduce that inflammation. Self-massage, like I said, that increases your oxytocin levels, which helps with pain management. So you'll feel less pain if you've got higher levels of oxytocin. And finally, magnesium baths. So you might not want to have a bath, or you might, but definitely you can have a foot bath. Just really soak up the magnesium, help your muscles relax, help reduce the inflammation, and that should be really beneficial. Actually, there's one study which showed that magnesium supplementation was as effective as painkillers. So, really make sure you're taking that time for yourself. Some nutritional strategies include making sure you have some blood sugar friendly snacks on hand. So if we're in pain, if we're not feeling well, it can be really tempting to just grab whatever's there or to grab the most comforting food. But in the long run, that can actually make things worse. So I would recommend things like smoothies. Again, I'll send you some really good recipes that you can use. Dark chocolate and cashews or other types of nuts, applesauce, cinnamon, and walnuts, or something more savory, so rye bread with egg or avocado or smoked salmon. So, the smoked salmon, the walnuts, they give you your omega-3. Cinnamon helps with blood sugar regulation. Dark chocolate is high in magnesium. Liver pate and egg have got those proteins, avocado, those fats. So you're really trying to help your body, nourish your body, not spike the blood sugar and not spike inflammation. The other thing I recommend is take care of yourself beforehand. So if you know that when you have a painful period, you're not able to cook, you're not able to walk or move or do anything useful, make sure that you've taken care of yourself already and have some healthy meals in your freezer. So some recommendations would be chicken soup or vegetable soup with roast chickpeas or lentils. So again, there you've got those sources of proteins, or beef stew or red lentil stew. Those two are really good because they're really high in iron. And if you have painful periods, likelihood is they're quite heavy. So you'll be losing a lot of iron. So it's important that you eat iron-rich foods during those times. Again, I'll be sending you some recipes. And some additional little treats that I think can be helpful. So like I said, magnesium. So really don't be shy about the dark chocolate or cocoa powder during your period. You need that magnesium to help your muscles relax. Fennel tea with a bit of raw honey can be really helpful to reduce cramping. So stomach cramping, flatulence, gas, anything like that, fennel tea is really beneficial. And I would really recommend during your periods, I know you'll be feeling tired and run down, but don't use coffee too much because it will be spiking your stress hormones and your blood sugar levels, and that can then have a downstream negative effect on your on your period pain. So there's some alternatives you can use, and I've written about those on my website, but I'll send you some recipes in the pack at the end of the webinar as well. And finally, you can try keeping frozen grapes in your freezer as a treat. So just put a little box of grapes in there, and they're a really nice, cooling, soothing, sweet thing to have when you're in a lot of pain. Other things might be things like hibiscus tea, which can lower estrogen levels though, so this might be only good to use if you have high levels of estrogen, or frozen bananas in the freezer, and then you can make yourself some ice cream when in need. Now, it's really important with nutrition to remember that everybody and every body is different. So that means no one recommendation is going to work for everyone. And some of these recommendations may work really well for you and others might make no difference at all. So it's a bit of a trial and error game to find out what works for you. But you might already have a bit of a gut feeling of, this is something I really don't do or I could do more of, pointing you in the right direction. But that's why sometimes it can be really helpful to work with an integrative medicine professional or nutritional therapist, because they can help you find out the pattern for you. So what are your root causes and what are the best ways for you to address those root causes? So just to give you an overview of some of the things that we can do, we can offer you hormone testing and more in-depth hormone testing than a GP will typically offer. We can also understand your stress hormones better. We can offer stool testing to see if there's any digestive reasons that could be causing your inflammation, prostaglandin or hormone imbalances. And we can offer you targeted supplement protocols. So like I said before, I really wouldn't recommend just going out and buying supplements because many times the ingredients will have different effects or they won't be as effective or they could be interacting with things or it might just not be the right thing for you. So that's a lot of wasted money and effort. I just wanted to show you what a typical hormone test would look like. So you can see over here that it measures your estrogen levels, your progesterone levels, and your testosterone levels. And it measures your cortisol levels over here, as well as your daily cortisol pattern. Now, this is really helpful to know because by having all of these 5 markers, we know where the problem probably lies. So for example, if your progesterone is really low, we know probably you're not ovulating and there's something going on with your endometrial lining. Or if it's really high, that can tell us that actually probably your endometrial lining is staying too thick throughout the month, so shedding becomes really painful. We can also see the detoxification process. So I showed you this earlier. You want your estrogen hormone here to be detoxifying down this pathway and to be peed out here. So you can see over here, this person's detoxification is very low, which means probably estrogen levels are getting stuck here where you can see it's high here, here, and here. So then we know, okay, this person has really high estrogen levels. We need to help them detoxify that, metabolize that, and by doing so, perhaps we can address some of their symptoms. So we can be really targeted instead of playing around for ages trying to figure out what's wrong. This is what a sample supplement protocol might look like. So you can see we've got kind of things for inflammation. This one contains some magnesium and other things that help with blood glucose balancing. So sometimes if your blood sugar has been off for a long time, it can be hard to regulate with just diet. So we might need to give your body a bit of a kickstart. And for example, iron as well. So it's really important that you take a good source of iron that gets absorbed well and that doesn't cause side effects. So really, don't go out and buy any supplements, work with someone and find the right supplements for you. So if you did want to work with me, you can reach me via my website or email. And I'd love for you to connect with me and share your feedback on Instagram or Facebook. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts were. I'd love to hear what you'd like to hear about next. And I'd love if you shared with people that you think might find this webinar useful. So I'm just going to try and pull up the your questions to see if I have any questions down here. So the first question I've got is whether the pill will affect the period and the recommendations that I've been giving. So yes, it does actually, because like I mentioned before, when you're taking the pill, you won't be ovulating typically. So that means that your progesterone and estrogen, LH and FSH levels stay quite stable throughout your period. So if you are on the pill and you know that when you're on the pill, your pain is much less, that's probably an indication that when you're off the pill and you have pain, it's something to do with hormone imbalances that triggering that pain. If that's the case, then all these same recommendations will work for you. So, it's a good way to find out what's causing the pain, but in general, these recommendations I'm giving will be the same whether you're on the pill or off the pill. And then the second question, typical follicular phase. So a typical follicular phase is, so what they used to say is it's 14 days. So you've got day 1, the start of your period, and then they assume that we ovulate on day 14. Now we know that that phase varies quite significantly. What's always the same is, so when the day you ovulate, it will always be 14 days until your period starts. So if you want to find out when you last ovulated, you just count 14 days back from your period, the first day of your period. But the follicular phase can vary. So a normal full cycle is 21 to 32-ish days. Or 35, that's probably still within the norm as well. But if you're noticing you're way longer than 35 days or way less than 21 days, or it's wildly all over the place, that could be a sign that it's dysregulated. But if you're always 21 days, that's probably that might be just your normal cycle. You just might have a very short cycle. Okay, any other questions from anyone before we finish? No, seems like those were the only questions. So thank you all so much for participating. In the next week, you'll be getting a webinar pack. So you'll get the slides and a handout, which just summarizes again the things I talked about today and includes a bunch of recipes for you to use. And like I said, I'd love to hear your feedback. So please do post on the Facebook group or my Instagram page and let me know what you thought. Or you can reach out to me privately via my email as well, of course. And do share. So if you found these resources helpful, then please share with friends who might also find them helpful. All right.